From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. While much of this blue sky conversation with my guest, Dr. Elizabeth Henry, aka Dr. Liz, will be about parenting and the well-being of kids, there are also lessons to be learned about ourselves and all of our interpersonal relationships. Dr. Liz is a board-certified pediatrician, a parent coach, speaker, best-selling author, and workshop facilitator with over 20 years of experience. She's a trusted advisor to parents and youth and the founder of Dr. Liz Consulting. Her 2021 book, You Are Not a Bad Parent, A Pediatrician's Guide to Reducing Conflict and Connecting with Your Teens, reached #1 in the Parenting Teenagers and Parenting Reference bestseller lists on Amazon. Dr. Liz graduated from Princeton University and the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. She completed her pediatric residency at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C., then subsequently worked at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia before joining a private practice in New Jersey. She's been honored for her work with youth and the community by several associations and publications, including the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, NAACP, and Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. I hope you enjoy this blue sky conversation with Dr. Liz Henry as much as I did. Dr. Liz Henry, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I have read some of your work. I've watched your past interviews. You're a very dynamic person. You also have a really strong education background. There's a lot of different fields you could have pursued in medicine alone. Why focus on kids and why the interest in parenting?
When I was choosing to decide what type of medicine I wanted to pursue, it was actually between OBGYN and pediatrics and a couple other things. But what I loved about pediatrics is that I could have a more preventive approach.
Yes.
And when you deal with adults have had lifelong habits
Yes.
for quite a long time, and smoking for 20 years or a lot of bad habits.
Right.
And kids are malleable. I thought I could make a difference early on in promoting their well-being. And I just love dealing with families because when I practiced, I would say that the parent was was a patient of mine as well as the children. So I take care
Absolutely.
of the whole family.
And you became a parent yourself.
Yes.
And I would imagine as a child, having a mom with your background is either like the greatest thing in the world or really challenging because how did your work and your research and your practice impact your own parenting?
Well, I have one daughter, one child. She's an only child, and she's 26 now, so she's grown.
Okay,
but she and I are very close. Actually, my husband and we're all close. Yeah. And I think that goes back to how I was raised by my mom, because I was raised by my mother and grandmother, and my mother was a social worker. So she was a great listener, and she was my #1 advocate and fan, my best friend, and I would tell her everything and share everything. And I wanted that for my daughter. And I realized that as a parent, you could create that close relationship with your children, but you had to cultivate it.
Right.
It didn't come automatically. So for my daughter, she knows that I can flip the switch. And so I know, a lot of people say, oh, you can't be their friend, but you can be a friend where they share information and they're open and they connect with you. But you have to know when to flip the switch and when to flip and be that mom. So you can't be their friend all the time, for sure. And so you have to turn on that parent mode, and they have to know that you can turn on that parent mode at any time.
I'm glad you mentioned the parent mode, because I think that's something we all struggle with, maybe more today than in the past. I know my parents never struggled with the idea of being our friends necessarily. The switch was more permanently on, I think, with a lot of our parents than today. Which brings me to a question. A lot of things in life, I think whatever that current adult generation is, they think it's harder today than it was in the past, that you always look to the past with sort of a hindsight bias. But let me ask you, is it harder, or at least different, being a parent today than it was for our parents' or grandparents' generation?
Oh, yeah. It's a whole new world. Both. I think it's harder and it's different. And of course, every generation has its challenges. So we'll all look back and say how tough we had it over our children, and our children will do the same. But it's night and day because of the technology.
Yes.
And the technology is increasing at an exponential pace. And when I grew up, there was no computer. We had a typewriter. We had the landlines. There was no cell phone. There were real neighborhoods where you could go out and play on the local playground. So today is different, and technology has changed the game, where it's not just kids. We're all on our cell phones. We all have smartphones. It exposes our children to experiences that we weren't exposed to at that age. So they have the opportunity to be exposed to mature material and to different things at an early age.
Yes. And so how do you think about technology and its use, restrictions? Jonathan Haidt is out with a book now called The Anxious Generation. I saw this weekend, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. We're recording this in May, so who knows where it'll be when this airs. And I find his work very interesting. So he goes to the extreme of saying we should not have cell phones in school, period, full stop, through high school, that the social media platform should enforce, 16 or older rules, that sort of thing. Others say, look, it's a fact of life. We got to figure out how to deal with it. Where do you come out on that whole debate?
Well, there's a general trend, and I think the Haidt book kind of touches on that panic mode for parents, right? And that fear that social media is the downfall of our children. And so, I'm not at that extreme, because there are benefits of technology and social media as well as risks. And what we need to do is we need to educate our children and have connections and foster those connections with our kids, so that we have them learn how to use social media and technology in a way that has them thrive. And also us as well as parents, we have to be role models. We can't say, do as I say and not do that as well. So every child is different. So we have to attend to the individual needs of the individual child, deal with the content, and talk to the social media companies about the design. So I think it's not an all or nothing.
Okay, so if you were a high school or an elementary school principal, middle school principal, would you have a policy about what would your? This is an unfair question because that's not what you are. But given your background, I mean, what would your policy be if you were a 7th, 8th, 9th grade, middle school principal?
Well, I don't think if I was a middle school principal, I would not allow the kids to bring their cell phones into the classroom. But it would have to be an enforceable principle. It couldn't, the enforcement couldn't just rely on the teachers, because the teachers are, it would have to be a rule that, they can't come into the school, or it has to be put in their locker or things like that. But the issue is that parents have to be on board. And you would think parents are on board, but because of the mass shootings and the different dangers now that occur in schools, there are a lot of parents, if you ask them, want their kids to be able to contact them, and they want to be able to contact their kids in cases of emergencies. So it's a lot more complicated than let's just take the phone out of the schools.
I was interested to hear Dr. Liz's reasoning behind deciding to be a pediatrician, that she saw this as a way to do work that's more preventive, as kids are more malleable than adults who are more set in their sometimes unhealthy ways. And while she's a pediatrician, she doesn't just work with kids, but tries to treat the whole family as much as possible. This approach is likely an outgrowth of the close relationship she herself had with her own mother when she was growing up. And I think she gives some good advice to parents about whether you can be friends with your kids when she says you can, but only up to a point. And there will be times when you need to, as she says, flip the switch from friend back to parent. And her take on technology like cell phones is interesting. She sees with optimism that social media can do some good and stops short on calling for a full ban on phones in schools. But she also recognizes the inherent dangers of the internet and says that whatever a school policy winds up being, parents need to be on board for any of it to be effective. Now back to some more on this subject. I'm so glad you mentioned the parents. It's so, because any of these policies, it's amazing how many parents will push back against the schools. And you raise a very valid point that was, sadly, it's an issue now that wasn't when I was in that age group, which is the school shootings and the need to reach children. Because that's another thing I don't think, and maybe I'm looking at it in not necessarily hindsight bias, because it wasn't always a great thing, but parents back when I was a kid, they rarely took the position of their kid when there was a dispute with the teacher. If I had a problem with a teacher, it was my problem, not the teacher's. And I wonder too if sometimes parents now. Let's talk about that. Are we sort of coddling our kids? That's another book that Jonathan Haidt wrote, The Coddling of the American Mind. Are we coddling our kids? Are we bubble wrapping them too much? Are we taking their side too much in disputes with adults, parents, principals, that sort of thing? Do you have a position on that?
Well, I think the key comes to really creating and having open, honest conversations with our children, and really having them know our values and philosophies. Like every parent, every family has certain values, philosophies, and expectations, and being consistent, right? And enforcing them or having whatever consequences if they don't abide by those. But it's important to have that connection, because I think one, I would call it a pitfall parents have, is that to assume that because you're their parent, there's an automatic connection. Like you're automatically connected to your child because you're their parent.
Right.
But forgetting that kids, no matter how old they are human beings. Right. And that connection, that relationship is the same as you have to foster the relationship as you foster any other relationship. So that connection is not automatic. Yes, you're the parent and you expect them as a parent to, do what you say and all of that, but you're not automatically going to get that connection where they're going to be open, they're going to be honest, they're going to come to you if they have a challenge. And that's important to foster through all of this, through the social media. So just taking away their phone, I don't think is really going to make a difference, or let's take away your phone as a consequence.
Right.
So I really think that this conversation and connection is the key to really fostering that relationship with our children.
And one of the reasons I was excited to have you on the show is that you have challenging work, but somehow you approach it with this incredibly upbeat and optimistic frame of mind. And even the title of one of your books is "You Are Not a Bad Parent: A Pediatrician's Guide to Reducing Conflict and Connecting with Your Teens." A lot of people, especially parents of teenagers, beat themselves up as being a bad parent. How do you define sort of good parent, bad parent, and what was it that made you say, I need to write a book that convinces people that they're not a bad parent?
Well, the reason I wrote that book is because as a pediatrician for over 20 years, parents would come to me for advice and guidance, not just about the physical issues that their kids are having, but the emotional, like they're having problems in school or someone is bullying them. So I realized that parents needed guidance on those issues. And they would come, who would they come to but their resident pediatrician? But we only have 15 minutes of time to deal with everything there is to deal with. And that's certain, their issues are extremely important, and that is not enough time. So I became passionate about guiding parents and about guiding teens in having the young people to be their best selves. And I realized that a lot of parents, when they would come to me, they would feel guilty about the things that they were doing or the things that they were not doing. And they were comparing themselves to other parents. And they would frequently express the opinion that, oh, I think I'm a bad parent. I'm not doing it right. I don't know what I'm doing. And I wrote this book to remind parents that, especially if you're asking the question whether or not you're a bad parent, the answer is most likely you're not, because you're concerned about doing it right, doing it well, and all those sorts of things. So I wrote a guide for parents really to hold them by the hand and guide them through these difficult challenges that they're going to face during the teenage years.
Well, you said a lot of important things there, and I appreciate what you said about parents comparing themselves to other parents, and also what you said earlier about we as adults need to think about our social media. It is so much easier to compare yourself to others these days because you're seeing so much of others these days on social media, and it's harder because you're seeing their best on social media. Rarely are people, posting the awful argument they had with a teenager who wouldn't uncross their arms and actually talk to them at the dinner table. You see the successes, the triumphs, the graduations, the honors. And, some people have said social media is insidious because you compare everyone's outsides with your insides, and parents can fall prey to that too. So can you talk about that, the influence of social media, even on parenting?
Right. I mean, it's as you said. I mean, it often the benefits of social media are that you can see what other people are doing and really gain tips that you like that you didn't know. Oh, I didn't realize. Oh, that's an idea. Or you educate yourself on cooking and also connecting with others. So there are tons of benefits with social media, but then the downside is that you forget that people are only posting a filter of who they are, right? And then you're comparing yourself, you're making yourself feel bad. And that's why, also going back to that social media at 16, that cutoff.
Yes.
Well, we're doing the same thing, and we're beyond 16.
Exactly. Right. Nothing magic happens on your 16th birthday.
There's no magic number. So if you're not actually, and social media is not going away, technology is not going away, it's going to get worse. So the key really is educating ourselves as adults and educating our children on how to use it effectively and in a way that's empowering rather than disempowering.
Yes.
And you can use yourself as an example. Like, so if I'm comparing myself, you can even have this conversation with your teen. Like, I'm falling into the same trap as you. I'm comparing myself to this family, and then having this discussion and not putting this wall up like, well, you're comparing yourself and I'm not comparing yourself, but being vulnerable and saying, look, I just did the same thing I told you not to do.
Yes. Yes.
and that creates this conversation, and it allows your teenager to see that you're human and how you're shifting and changing.
Dr. Liz offers more great advice to parents when she says they shouldn't assume an automatic connection with their kids, and that in making those connections, it's important to have open and honest conversations with an emphasis on imparting your most important values. And to everyone listening who's been a parent or is raising teenagers right now, I like Dr. Liz's advice to stop being so hard on ourselves. This is a tough job, no matter who's doing it and how much they care. And to everyone listening who was raised by a parent or two, perhaps you can try to look back on your own parent shortcomings and be a little more forgiving. Now, back to my blue sky conversation with Dr. Liz Henry. So there's lots of debate on how we might address what is a real epidemic, I suppose, of teen and youth mental health, a real crisis. It doesn't seem like there's much debate that there's a crisis, that something is different, something's happening. Have you seen that in the course of your career and your research? And if so, like sort of when and how did you start seeing it change in your patient group and your parent group?
Well, definitely there is a crisis. As you said, everybody agrees with that. And I've been seeing along the way a ton of kids with anxiety. And anxiety and depression. And I think a lot of that is the nature of the times and the things that they are going through. So have we ever had a pandemic before where we're in lockdown and social media and we're still we still have consequences of that, right? It's COVID-19 has not gone away. And so that's created a whole new set of worries for our young people. The threat of climate change is more visible, right? With the storms and the catastrophes, and this has never happened before. But there have been a lot of things that have never happened before that keep happening, right? And the climate change, the school shootings, all of these things are life events. They're existential events.
Sure.
That impact our teens' mental health. So they have these issues and worries heaped on to the normal worries of being a teen, and looking good and fitting in and belonging and dating and the drama with their parents. And then you have all these huge existential events, and it's a toll.
Yeah.
These are challenging times, and all of these things are taking a toll.
And it seems in your profession, another challenge is, you mentioned 15-minute sessions with your patients, and that's historically been physical health. That's let's check your tonsils, let's see if you got strep, and now you mentioned anxiety, depression, and we also have a shortage, as I understand it, of mental health professionals. So what are your thoughts on that? And if you could sort of wave a magic wand, what would you do to try to address this in terms of servicing this growing population of kids with challenges?
Yeah, and it's been hard on pediatricians and primary care providers, and because, as you said, there is a shortage of mental health providers, especially those who specialize in mental health for kids and teens. And when you find a good mental health provider, then there's the insurance issue that gets in the way. And so a lot of mental health providers that may be valuable and great don't take insurance. And so parents will have to pay out of pocket, which can be unaffordable. So I think having counselors, like true counselors in school or accessible to schools. And so it's not just the typical, you refer to a specialist and you make an appointment, but there's centers there, and they're developing those in New Jersey. They're developing consortiums and different central hubs in communities where access is easier for mental health. Because also it depends on what community you live in. If you're in inner city, in an urban area, you may even have less access to good mental health care.
Right, or rural settings where transportation's an issue, and which brings me to, as someone who looks for silver linings and pluses in tough times. One silver lining, it seems, of the pandemic is the growth in telemedicine and telehealth services. And I was involved with nonprofit work and board leadership in Maine, the state of Maine, during the pandemic, and seeing the incredible growth in telemedicine, and then also learning that it can be particularly effective in mental health care, which seemed a little counterintuitive to me because I thought that sort of personal face-to-face approach was important. And it is, but it's also very helpful to take away the transportation barriers, to take away the stigma of sitting in the waiting room of a mental health professional and just going straight to telemedicine. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when you started practicing, that was not a thing, not at all. And now it is. So can you share your thoughts on telehealth and telemedicine?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great opportunity for people, as you said, who don't have access or to mental health to access mental health providers. So it takes away the geographical limitation.
Yes,
and it allows people to have access to a wider number of mental health providers, so you can go out of area. So if I'm in New Jersey or central New Jersey, I can see a mental health provider who lives in South Jersey.
Yes.
So I think that is great, and it is the silver lining from the pandemic, right? Yep. Because telemedicine existed, but it wasn't really utilized that much.
Right. So back to your book. There's in the sort of the blurb about your book, or in the promotion of your book, and I want you to sell a lot of books. So if this is a spoiler that you don't want to put out, you say you mentioned a surprising source of conflict that arises between parents and teens. Can you share with us what that surprising conflict is?
The surprising conflict. Well, it's really what it comes down to is you're on different wavelengths. You both want the same, you both want the same thing. It's like a tug of war. That's really one of the things I describe in the book. It's like a tug of war. No one wants to be wrong, right? Like when you're there, like your child doesn't want to be wrong. You don't want to be wrong. And what we often associate with right and wrong is good and bad. Right?
Yes. Yes.
So in being wrong, subconsciously, people are thinking, well, if I'm wrong, I'm bad, right? Bad, wrong, what?
Right.
And no one wants to be bad. So, that's why there are blowups over these simple issues, right? Like everybody, the parent wants to be right. The kid wants to be right. No one wants to be wrong. No one wants to be bad. So you have this tug of war to try to win, like this issue, like there's a battle. And what we don't realize is that there's no battle to win. It's there,
right.
The relationship, it's not a battle. It's not your tug of war. And sometimes you just have to let go of the rope.
Love that. And I'm glad I asked that question and you answered it that way, because something else I wanted to ask you is, obviously not everyone listening to this podcast is currently a parent, has ever been a parent, or they're a parent like you and I, and our kids are not under our roof anymore. And what my question was going to be, how would you apply the things you've learned to other relationships, adult to adult? And I think you just hit on it, which is this tug of war, it seems, is definitely increasing in our society in terms of every issue. We fight over this, that, and the other. And we feel like we have to win, or if we disagree with someone on a political issue, they're bad, I'm good. I don't just dislike their position, I dislike them as people because we don't agree. Can you talk about that? Because I think that is a huge issue in our society, and the mental health challenges that we all have. Again, it's not just kids, adults. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that we've gotten, as a society, so polarized. And the key is to recognize that, and this is for parents and kids, and you can expand it to adults and everyone in general. The key is that everybody's point of view, whether we like it or not, where we think it's completely ridiculous or not, is their point of view, right? And
Right.
it's valid to them. It's valid to them.
Yep.
And it's really in listening and in hearing other people, we have to acknowledge that it could be completely ridiculous, but their point of view is valid. And I think that's what's missing, is that acknowledgement that you hear me.
Yes.
Right? You
Yes.
hear me. You may not agree, but you actually hear what I'm saying. Okay, you said what you said. It's valid to you. I disagree, but rather than that shutdown, you're completely wrong and you're bad, right? And I really think it's that blurred line, right, between I disagree, like you said, and if I disagree with you, something's wrong with you and you're bad. And then as soon as that other person thinks you think they're bad, you're going on the defensive. It's just automatic. It's just about being human. It's like, if you did that to me, I'm going,
Yeah,
because I
right.
don't
You're
want to
ready.
be that. I don't want, and I'm going to fight back, or I'm going to, or say something with my words that are cutting. And so it's kind of recognizing that.
Yes. And earlier you were saying you would encourage parents and kids to realize they're on the same team and they want the same goals. I think that applies in our society with adults as well, where if you sit down with someone on the other side of the political spectrum, and instead of starting with the disputes, you put together a list of all the things you agree on, it's remarkably long. Right? You might not agree with the methods, but you agree you want kids to be safe. You want the air to be clean. You want climate change to be abated. You agree on so much. It comes down to a short list of things and usually a list of tactics that you disagree on. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that sounds perfectly correct and on point. And that brings me to one of the things that I say about kids is that I'd like to shift the paradigm as far as how we see kids, right? Because often kids are, because they don't vote, right?
Right.
They
Right.
they're put on the back burners, and so all the policies, all the decisions, everything is not necessarily made with the next generation in mind.
Yes. No, right.
And as adults, we often think, I still think many adults think kids should be seen and not heard. They can't make a contribution now, wait till they're immature. But kids can make a contribution now. And we've seen children make contributions now. And their opinions can be very telling and can forward us in various areas. They can add fresh ideas, be creative. A lot of times as parents, we're preparing kids for when they become adults, right? Where we're preparing, we're getting them to the right school, we're getting them to the right extracurricular activities, as if we're preparing them for life as adults and forgetting they're living life right now. And we're forgetting to be present to who they are right now, the contributions that they can make right now. And if we as a society actually put kids first,
Yeah.
and made decisions on how does this impact and affect the next generation? How will it impact this 5-year-old, this public policy decision I'm making? I think the world would be a different place.
The healthcare system in the U.S. faces a lot of stresses and strains, a primary one being the shortage of care providers, especially in mental health services. It's my hope that we'll see more professionals entering this field, more patients being treated with convenient and effective telehealth consults, and better prevention and support services leading to a decrease in overall demand. Regarding the tug of war in which kids and parents often find themselves, Dr. Liz says we should be sure we at least listen to the views of the others in this conflict, and while we might not reach an agreement that makes everyone happy, at least everyone feels heard. And I love the point she makes that parents see their job as preparing their kids to be adults, and sometimes this makes it hard for them to see them as the children that they are right now. Now, to my final segment with Dr. Liz Henry. We fall in this trap of remembering, well, when I was a kid, and when I was a kid, we didn't have drills for shooters. We didn't have active shooter drills. Okay, now we did. Well, we had fire drills. I'm too young to have experienced the nuclear attack drills that our parents had, where they told you to get under a desk if a nuclear bomb was coming, which really wouldn't do a whole lot.
That made a difference.
But I think I assume, and I'd like to hear your opinion, it'd be helpful for us to listen a little bit more to kids. When you said before, and I asked you about phones in schools, and you said, well, parents want them in some cases so they can hear from their kids if there's a shooting. That hadn't occurred to me, because I didn't deal with that. Even with my kids, there were actually, I take that back. There were shooter drills with my kids, but it's gotten worse. It's helpful for us, it seems to me, to check in with kids on these issues to get a sense for what's it like today, because it is different than when we were kids. Fair?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we should make decisions in a vacuum. And that's part of why my book is talking about how do you connect to young people, because I don't think we connect, or we kind of poo-poo that their ideas and that sort of thing. But really asking kids, like, instead of trying to figure out what kids want, ask them.
Yeah, right.
I know that's a novel. It sounds like a novel idea, but if you're want to make a decision, impacting kids, ask them, use them, put them on advisory boards, and so that you can get their take on things. Because, as you said, we haven't grown up in that environment, so things don't even occur to us,
right,
about young people, because we've never been put in that situation.
And I imagine, too, sometimes parents don't ask because they're afraid the kid's going to ask for something that they can't say yes to. And that goes back to that switch. If it's something you can't say yes to, then okay, be the parent, don't say yes, but at least hear them out, and maybe that'll inform your thinking in the future, or they'll come up with something that you can say yes to and say, gee, I hadn't thought about that.
What do you mean? Say more about that.
So in other words, you said we should ask kids more about what they think. I think one of the reasons we don't as parents is we're afraid they're going to ask for something and we have to be a bad guy and say no.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's okay to say no. You're the parent. You can flip that switch. But in asking, you might learn something that could be incredibly valuable that you could say yes to. Or if you can't say yes, it could inform your parenting down the road.
Yeah. And
ask.
One thing I say is be interested, right? Like, be interested in your kids. Ask questions if they like, ask them, why you like this music, ask them about their interests and engage them in conversation.
Instead of saying, turn down that music, it's like, why do you like that music? That's so different from what I grew up with. You might learn something.
And then we were saying we're afraid to say that we may have to say no, but we're asked by our colleagues about things all the time and every day, and we're not afraid to say no.
Right.
And it's just like that. It's a two-way conversation, and you can say yes, you can say no, you can say, why'd you ask that? This is why I said no, because X, Y, and Z.
Speaking of just say no. I'll go on another difficult topic, challenging topic, drugs and alcohol. Always been an issue in parenting, always been an issue, I think, in the teenage years, maybe further complicated today by the, I guess if you will, the acceptance of, say, marijuana legalization or decriminalizing. How do you help parents navigate those choppy waters of kids experimenting or worse with drugs and alcohol?
Well, have that conversation early and often. Just having the conversation doesn't mean that, oh, it's going to give them the idea and that they're going to go out and do it. So it's important that early on they understand your values, the philosophy. And this generation, especially Gen Z, love explanations. So to say just don't do it because it's unhealthy is not necessarily as helpful as to I don't want you to, I know and also it's important to acknowledge their environment that they're growing up in. So saying, I know that, kids around you may be trying drugs or alcohol and you may be offered that, but I don't want you, or we don't want you to partake in that, and this is why we and stress their interests and their potential and what you think that would take away from, and really, and then sit down and have that conversation. And then they may be like, well, I don't think so. And then you can say, well, why don't you think so? Not just don't do it.
Yeah,
and
right.
So it just takes really fostering and nurturing that conversation where they know that you're interested in their well-being and being happy and thriving, and that certain things will take them off course,
Right.
For their physical and mental and emotional health.
You mentioned kids' potential, and as we approach the end of our conversation, I wanted to run something by you. I interviewed a gentleman named Charles Kenny, who's written a lot about how the world is getting better all the time, and we don't always appreciate it. And he stopped me in my tracks because I was talking about the younger generation, sort of high school, middle school age today, and the fears they have and the concerns they have and the sense of doom and pessimism. And he said, it really concerns me. He said, because that generation could be the greatest generation in the history of the world. I said, where are you getting that? He said, well, think about it. They're going to be the largest in number. They're going to have the longest life expectancy. They're incredibly tech savvy. They're incredibly open to social differences, accepting of difference. And if we could just keep them hopeful and optimistic and get out of their way, they could be the greatest generation in the history of the world. Now, you've spent a lot of time with kids over many years. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, it sure does. It definitely does, because they're also the most diverse generation, and they have so much compassion and empathy, and a lot of times we use that as a weakness,
Right.
and say, oh, they're snowflakes, or
Right.
they're so sensitive,
Yeah.
they got to toughen up. But that really is a strength.
Yeah.
And, that really is a strength, that they can empathize, that they're sensitive, and you can say their sensitivity is a weakness, but compassion, you can change the way you look at sensitivity and say it's not sensitivity, it's compassion.
Yep.
It's empathy.
Yep.
And that allows them to see life and make decisions in a different way than our generation.
I think that's really important to think of it that way. And we are lucky to be, the more time I think you spend around young people, especially as you get to my sort of get off my lawn age, you realize that there is so much strength in younger people, always has been. And if we can keep communication lines open, learn from great people like you, Dr. Liz, read your books, we're going to be much better off with this next generation. I think we're going to be in very good hands if we could sort of keep them optimistic and kind of get out of their way.
Yes, I agree. Have that intergenerational conversation.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Liz, thank you so much for the work that you've done, for the spirit you bring to it, and for taking this time to speak with our audience here at the Blue Sky Podcast. I really appreciate it. I encourage everyone to get out and buy your book. You Are Not a Bad Parent, A Pediatrician's Guide to Reducing Conflict and Connecting with Your Teens. And I hope you all take some valuable lessons from this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Liz.
No, thank you for having me.
Dr. Liz closes this episode by encouraging parents to try hard to connect with their kids and take a genuine interest in them. Advice that would serve us well in all of our relationships. Letting other people know that we're truly interested in their well-being is one of the greatest gifts we can offer. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Dr. Liz Henry. We'd appreciate it if you'd take the time to leave us a rating or review to let us know how we did. And consider subscribing to this podcast and following the Optimism Institute on social media. All of our Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On Studios. You can learn more about their work at soundonstudios.com. And all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.